Greetings, speed enthusiasts!
Today we will review the qualifying rounds of the 15-second motorcycle category of the fourth round of the Barranquilla 2025 quarter-mile drag racing championship.
We begin with a duel between two Pulsar NS200 ridden by Nafer Rosado and Ricardo Zulbarán. Nafer Rosado on his Pulsar NS200 commits a false start, so the victory goes to Ricardo Zulbarán on his Pulsar NS200.
The next duel was supposed to be between Yalitza Donato on her Pulsar NS200 versus the Suzuki AX of Brandon Rivera. However, the latter does not show up, so he is disqualified.
Thus, we move on to the next matchup, which was supposed to be between the Suzuki AX of Daniel Dominguez versus the AKT NKD of Jesus Caspillo. However, the latter also does not show up, so he is disqualified.
This leads us to a duel between Giandral Garcia on his AKT NKD versus the Pulsar NS200 of Brian Padilla. The victory goes to Brian Padilla on his Pulsar NS200.
The next duel is between Camilo Blanco and Andrés Millán, both aboard their Pulsar NS200. Camilo Blanco on his Pulsar NS200 commits a false start, so the victory goes to Andrés Millán on his Pulsar NS200.
The next duel was supposed to be between Yalitza Donato on her Pulsar NS200 versus Ricardo Zulbarán on his Pulsar NS200. by mistake, it is Daniel Dominguez on his Suzuki AX who takes the start. This duel is annulled as two riders faced each other who were not supposed to. Thus, we now move on to the actual duel between Ricardo Zulbarán on his Pulsar NS200 versus Yalitza Donado on her Pulsar NS200.
Both riders commit a false start, so this duel must be repeated. So while the riders return to the start, we move on to the next duel between the Suzuki AX of Daniel Dominguez versus the Pulsar NS200 of Brian Padilla. Again, both riders commit a false start, so this duel must also be repeated. But while the riders return to the start, we move on to the next matchup between Nairo Quintero and Andrés Millán, both aboard their Pulsar NS200.
Nairo Quintero, on his Pulsar NS200, records an ET of 14.870 seconds, so he is disqualified from this category and sent to compete in the 14-second motorcycle category. Thus, the victory goes to Andrés Millán on his Pulsar NS200.
The next duel is between Ricardo Zulbarán on his Pulsar NS200 versus Yalitza Donado on another Pulsar NS200.
on her Pulsar NS200, commits a false start. So the victory goes to Ricardo Zulbarán on his Pulsar NS200, who now waits for his next rival, the winner of the following duel between the Suzuki AX of Daniel Dominguez versus the Pulsar NS200 of Brian Padilla.
The victory goes to Brian Padilla on his Pulsar NS200, who will then face Ricardo Zulbarán on his Pulsar NS200.
Victory goes to Brian Padilla on his Pulsar NS200. His next opponent will be Andrés Millán on another Pulsar NS200.
The winner is Andrés Millán on his Pulsar NS200, and he will now face Giovannis Contreras on his Pulsar NS200. Andres Millán on his Pulsar NS200 lights up the 4 bulbs in pre-stage and stage. However, his front tire ends up blocking the stage sensor by a small margin, which causes a slight movement of his front tire to stop blocking the sensor at the moment the light sequence begins. This ends up generating a foul that leaves him stuck at the start. Thus, Giovanni Contreras on his Pulsar NS200 takes an easy victory and will then face Edinson Gomez on another Pulsar NS200.
The victory goes to Edinson Gomez on his Pulsar NS200, and he will then face in the final the Suzuki AX of Zidane Martinez.
Ya se quitó al final.
Zidane Martinez on his Suzuki AX records an ET of 14.945 seconds. So, he is disqualified from this category and sent to compete in the 14-second motorcycle category. Thus, the victory goes to Edinson Gomez on his Pulsar NS200, who in this way wins the Champions Trophy of the 15-second motorcycle category of this 4th round of the Barranquilla 2025 quarter-mile drag racing championship. Congratulations to him and his team.